Sex and power, two things that any mind growing up in patriarchal society will automatically associate with each other. The 1997 film Executive Power attempts to deal with this synonymy, offering the viewer a dark look into presidential politics and scandals. With sexual abuse charges being brought against Republican presidential candidate frontrunner Herman Cain, sex and politics are tied together more than ever in the public mind. Stories like these raise the question: are sexually immoral people capable of leading a country, and does this sexual immorality serve as a gateway into other devious behavior? Executive power argues that sexual immorality and hypermasculinity always lead to corruption and bad government. It achieves this argument in three major ways. First, it vilifies the sexually immoral political leaders. Second, it romanticizes traditional sexual immoralities. And finally, it weakens sexual immorality, making it something that can and will be conquered by more traditional moralities. We will begin by examining how executive power vilifies the sexually immoral. Executive power presents characters who are hypermasculine, breaking and contorting what Trujillo in 1991 identified as the 5 characteristics of hegemonic masculinity: physical force and control, occupational achievement, familial patriarchy, frontiersmanship, and heterosexuality. These hypermasculine characters are then vilified, suggesting that the marginalization that Fahey in 2007 has suggested happens on both sides of the hegemonic masculine spectrum, not just the feminine homosexual side. The movie opens on a girl having a stroke and dying while having extramarital sex with President John Fields. The message is clear: extreme heterosexuality kills and has monstrous consequences. Executive power then focuses on how this hyper-heterosexuality has corrupted at least 2 other President Fields' characteristics of hegemonic masculinity. In the scene with Mrs. Fields, President Fields shows that familial patriarchy is something of which he has lost sight. Although he tries to appease her, he does so for purely tactical and political reasons. Instead of trying to reconcile with his wife on any loving and nurturing side, he negotiates with her, promising to work on domestic policy if she keeps her mouth closed about his extramarital affairs. Familial patriarchy seems to be lost here. In a study by Sharer in 2001, he showed that hypermasculine characteristics, like callousness towards women, were often characteristics of bad guys and criminals. President Fields is no exception. For most of the movie, the viewer is led to believe that President Fields is behind the killings in the pursuit of protagonist Nick Seeger. Dialogue from Nick 2/3 of the way through the movie suggests that Fields is trying to kill off everyone who knew about the death of the girl. While this theory is ultimately proved wrong, the viewer believes it for most of the movie, vilifying Fields and corrupting his supposedly masculine characteristics of physical force and control. If the movie vilifies Fields for his hypermasculinity and sexual immorality, then it also romanticizes Nick's normative masculinity and traditional sexual morality. Nick, more so than President Fields, fits Fahey's 2007 definition of hegemonic masculinity. For Fahey, hegemonic masculinity is culturally idealized forms of masculine character, linking male identity with traits such as physical toughness and competitiveness, and elevating these above other stereotypical gender or sexuality traits. One major example of this demonstrated normative hegemonic masculinity comes to mind. First, Nick's sexual relationship with the female protagonist Susan is significantly different and significantly more normative than any other sexual relationship in the movie. Both Fields and his challenger Senator Mitchell have affairs over the course of the movie. Mrs. Fields also has an affair. The viewer begins to get a sense that these affairs are more about power than love or romance. Just like these affairs, especially those of President Fields and Senator Mitchell, serve to vilify the characters, Nick's sexual relationship with Susan serves to romanticize him into traditional hegemonic masculinity. Because the viewer has the sense that Nick cares about Susan and is not callous to her, and because the sex scene the characters share is appropriately tender and romantic, the viewer codes Nick as a traditionally masculine hero. With the stage now set for a battle between traditionally hegemonic masculinity on the good side and hypermasculinity on the bad side, we can examine how executive power asserts the victory of traditional masculinity and marginalizes hypermasculinity. Traditional masculinity repeatedly wins out over hypermasculinity and executive power. First, in a very real sense, the good guys win in the end. Even though Nick dies, Susan survives and the incriminating videotape has been copied. The reveal at the end shows that it has really been Mrs. Fields who has been worried about secrecy and finding the videotape. This reveal significantly alters the structure of the issues of the film and relates femininity to hypermasculinity, thus marginalizing both. Mrs. Fields seems to be working out of fear and weakness, characteristics Fahey says are typically coded as feminine. Because Mrs. Fields turns out to be the one behind all the hypermasculine conflict in the movie, the viewer is left with the feeling that hypermasculinity and femininity are two sides of the same coin. That is, they are both worthy of marginalization, and neither is as strong in leadership as traditional masculinity. It is clear to see that executive power holds traditional masculinity in high esteem, while marginalizing hypermasculinity. Today we have explored the ways in which hypermasculinity is negatively portrayed, the ways in which traditional masculinity is romanticized, and finally the ways in which traditional masculinity triumphs over hypermasculinity. Executive power gives us a groundwork for dealing with modern sexual scandals, like those of Herman Cain. The questions we must ask to decipher the public's view of Cain is whether or not the public views these scandals as an abuse of power, which is a hypermasculine trait, or as a heteronormative act, a traditionally masculine trait. In the end, traditionally masculine traits are still associated with positive and successful leadership in government, while hypermasculinity is marginalized as negative, harmful, and ultimately corrupt.